Hi, it's Jo and Steve again from Freshagenda. And this week we've been looking at world trade, Steve. We've just put out our monthly trade insights report.
Yep.
And it's showing a fairly small increase in trade in January in milk solids equivalent.
Yeah, we've got a new measure which we introduced when we added up 2017 trade. So we add up the solids trade, so more reflective of the change in milk solids use around the world, and particularly in the trade. So it also takes account of what's going on in the fat-filled market. The difference between the proteins and the fats has been quite important because fat trade has shrunk. Fats alone, butter fat, etc. So it's more reflective of how solids are being used globally.
So we found for most of last year, trade was pretty flat, but protein was well up, fat was down. But for January, they've actually both gone in the same direction, haven't they?
Yeah, both up. So in aggregate terms, it's up just a bit above 1%. So trade it's not roaring along.
No.
As we saw last year, it was mostly flat, as you said. But it's ticking up. And we'll come back to that because I think it's an interesting period they're in now for the next few months.
Yeah, and there's been some interesting little insights below that kind of top level take on trade. Probably New Zealand whole milk powder exports have been interesting. We've kind of seen a lump in the trade data in the last couple of months.
Yeah, so new data came out this week from New Zealand showing a mixed picture, whole milk up, and then we saw an interesting mix elsewhere, cheese down, butterfat down, skim milk powder flat. So it's a bit of a bumpy road. Cheese is particularly interesting, I think, with new capacity going in New Zealand to take advantage of certain markets growing. Cheese exports year on year have now fallen 7 months in a row. So and in January down, and February, down 11%. So it's got to be a worry. But whole milk is interesting. A couple of big things. I think the Chinese story. While we saw February's trade into China for whole milk fall quite a bit, you got to look at the bigger picture. You got to look at the peak in China, and we're showing this chart now of the New Zealand whole milk powder peak into that market. So over the past 3 months, there's been some shift in the patterns of trade, and timing is different. That tariff window is not as critical anymore in New Zealand. The difference in price is not material. So over the last 3 months, gone up nearly 3%. 4 months, gone up 4%. So it's growing as a bigger market, but not thundering along like we thought it might, or like the world thought it might.
Yeah, it's part of that story. We're seeing a lot more infant formula finished product going into China. Yeah,
and that's certainly still strong, and in the recent short term that's remained strong. Other things have been patchier.
I suppose the other interesting thing about whole milk powder was around Middle East, North Africa.
Yeah, and Southeast Asia. I think there's two regions which have been coming and going a bit lately. More, I suppose, more price-sensitive buyers there. Have in the Middle East, North Africa, obviously knocked around by the oil trade, oil prices being low. They're coming back, but it's clear from both regions their numbers in New Zealand's exports in February were very strong.
Yes,
and what's going on here? But if you look back, and what we're showing here is some price history. The spot prices dipped late last year, dipped into quite a well when New Zealand's output looked quite strong, and we saw that crash in the market in Europe. So it's clear that buyers in those regions have taken advantage of that dip and filled up supplies.
Yep. And that's being shipped now.
Yeah, that's being shipped now, so it's showing up in the numbers. But what it might also show is for the coming months, things might slow down again.
Yeah.
So because prices are back to reasonably high level, relatively high levels. New Zealand farmers wouldn't like us to say that, but that's where they are on that recent price history.
Yeah.
Yeah. On the other side of that, we've got Chinese import numbers coming out. So we see the exports from the regions, and we always add up the exports.
Line it up with the imports.
Yeah, and the import side for China put out overnight, there'll be a lot of reaction to this, we think, because it's mostly red ink.
Yes, for the month.
For the month, yeah. Again, step back, look at a longer period. The numbers aren't so bad, and across the board, they're reasonably strong, but again, will that persist?
Yeah, there's a bit of a story about recovery in local supply and how that's going to impact import demand for some of those, particularly some of those ingredients.
Yeah, that's right. So that's a changing milk use story in China, which is quite interesting.
For sure.
Which is probably the subject of a longer video, but probably not as interesting.
Something to look forward to.
Yeah.
Cheese.
I think cheese, cheese is really interesting. There's been a fairly topical story in Australia about that booming cheese imports, which is destroying the market apparently.
People don't like to see that.
No, it's a sensitive issue when we've got price pressure on here and when supply is weaker and the like. A big factory got knocked out by a fire. So without the capacity to produce the cheese, we've had to import a lot more from New Zealand mainly. So that is now reversing. Cheese imports in the last 3 months have dipped, and in particular from New Zealand. New Zealand's imports are down 20% over that period. So that's reversing out of the system. Unfortunately, they were still importing a fair bit of cheap US cheese, not as big in volume, but that's still roaring along because of the price advantage the US has.
Yeah, and that's a global sourcing strategy that a lot of large food companies are going to maintain.
That's right.
Yep.
The last wrinkle in trade data is an interesting one, which again relates to what's going on across the ditch. PKE imports into New Zealand have continued to rocket along. Why do you reckon that is?
Well, I guess at the end of last year we had those dry conditions affecting pasture growth in New Zealand, and we saw a big demand. In fact, there was a bottleneck in terms of PKE imports and distribution. So high demand to cover those pasture gaps in those challenging months. Conditions have improved a bit, but they're still roaring along, aren't they?
They're still shipping big volumes. So the last 3 months, volumes are up 40% over the prior year. So it's quite a staggering increase, given someone's looking to quit those stocks because farmers are going to be penalised from June.
That's right. From June, Fonterra will be penalising overuse of PKE because they can test for it, and it does affect the milk. So, hopefully all that PKE finds a home. But there'll be some very fat cows in the next couple of months.
Or some great deals.
That's right.
Later in the year. So probably wrapping up, I guess our take on trade right now, we're in a bit of a hiatus. So spot prices, which we've got up there, are flattening out a bit. Not a lot of recent movement.
Yeah, butter and powders have basically been static for 3 weeks. So everybody's taking a bit of a wait and see attitude in terms of the EU spring, how much product's going to be available and where it's going to go. So watch this space.
Okay, that's a wrap from us. We'll see you again next week.